Hello and welcome to the Wine for Newbies podcast, a featured podcast from the WLW Wine Geek blog. As always, I'm your host, Bill Wilson, and I'm grateful that you're taking the time to listen today. In this episode, we're going to go a little bit off the beaten path, so to speak. Rather than explore a particular grape that makes wine or a wine region, we're going to learn about some of the ways that wine can benefit your health. Now, first off, I have to tell you I am not a doctor. I may have a Juris Doctor, a law degree, but that only qualifies me to tell you that this podcast should not be relied on in place of advice from a qualified physician. Every human body is different, and if you have questions or concerns, seek out competent medical advice. That being said, let's get on with the show. When I joined the Society of Wine Educators, I received a book titled In Vino Sanitas by Harvey E. Finkel, MD. And in this book, Dr. Finkel writes about the various medical studies that suggest, and I want to underline suggest, but don't necessarily prove, that moderate consumption of wine can be beneficial. Now, at this point, the book is 4 years old. It was published in 2002. And new studies come out all the time, so the thinking of the medical community may be a little bit different today than when Dr. Finkel wrote his book. So again, you should probably ask a qualified physician if you have questions. I can't give you medical advice. For years, health experts have been telling us that the American diet is lousy, to put it bluntly. We have cardiovascular disease coming out of our ears. We are way overweight as a nation, and we have way too much fat in our diet. But then there's this thing called the French paradox. The French eat as poorly as Americans do, and yet the French population doesn't have the health problems that the American population has. And the thinking is that it must be because the French drink much more red wine than Americans do. So the question naturally comes to mind, could there be something about red wine that offsets the evils in the French diet, all their high fat, high cholesterol? They may not eat fast food the way that Americans do, but no one will ever call French cooking light. The evidence that is out there suggests that red wine may in fact offset the problems in the French diet and thus offset the problems in the American diet. The evidence suggests there may be a tie here. Now, over 10 years ago, there was a study done that looked at the death rate among people who consumed alcohol. And in this study, the researchers found that among people who drink no alcohol, the death rate was about 1,500 per 100,000 American men. You got that? 1,500 per 100,000 American men. Among those who had one drink per day, the death rate dropped to about 1,250 per 100,000. Now, at 2 drinks per day, the death rate goes up a bit to about 1,325 per 100,000 American men. When we get to 3 drinks per day, we're back up to 1,500 per 100,000. At 4 drinks a day, we find the numbers are at 1,600 per 100,000. And at 5 drinks a day, we're at 1,750 per 100,000. And if we go up to 6 drinks a day, we hit 2,000 deaths per 100,000 American men. Now, if you were to plot these numbers out on a graph, where on the up and down axis, the y-axis, you'd have the number of deaths, and then on the horizontal, or the x-axis, I believe it is, you would put the number of drinks. If you just chart that out, you're going to see that it forms what the medical experts call a J-shaped curve. It almost looks like a check mark. It's a little higher at 0 drinks. It drops down at 1 drink, comes up a little bit at 2 drinks, and continues to go up all the way to 6 drinks. So what this data shows us is that for those who drink 1 to 2 glasses of wine per day, they tend to live longer than abstainers and much longer than heavy drinkers. Now, remember, this data applies only to men. For women, according to all of the research, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, the medical research suggests that 1/2 of this amount, a half a glass to 1 glass of wine, fits the same curve. Now, why does all of this happen? What's all this about? Well, from what we can tell, alcohol reacts with an enzyme in the body that detoxifies alcohol before it gets to the liver. And it turns out that that healthy women have only about 60% as much of this enzyme. They don't detoxify alcohol as quickly as men do. So when you look at this data, the bottom line appears to be a corollary to the old saying that an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Today we might say a glass of wine a day keeps the doctor away. Now, I should point out that this research shows that this is not an average of 1 glass per day. In other words, you can't go dry all week and then have 6 drinks on Friday night. It doesn't work that way. You cannot average them out. 1 glass a day appears to be the optimum for men, and 1/2 a glass a day appears to be the optimum for women. You can't play catch up on another day because you missed 1 day earlier in the week. Now, of course, we can argue about what makes up a glass. How much is in a glass of wine? Well, according to Dr. Finkel, it seems that a glass is about 4 ounces. And keep in mind that we're talking about optimal consumption. Now, you can go up to 2 drinks per day for men and still be below the non-drinker's death rate. But, the thing is, like most folks, I have to confess, I like to have more than 1 glass of wine when I have wine with dinner or at some party. So Dr. Finkel does us a favor, and he does some research and explains to us what the safe limit is. And it's well known among both the medical community and the non-professional community that alcohol damages the liver. We've all heard of cirrhosis of the liver, and this is where we start when we try to figure out what the optimal safe limit is. Now, for men, lasting liver damage occurs when we have an average consumption of 60 grams of alcohol per day. Thus, the medical professions feel that for men, the safe limit is 40 grams of alcohol per day. Now, in real-world terms, we have to understand that a 750 milliliter bottle of wine, your standard wine bottle, contains about 72 grams of alcohol. And thus, according to Dr. Finkel, for men, the safe limit is about 14 ounces, or just a little more than half a bottle of wine, because the wine bottle contains 25 ounces. So for men, we can theoretically safely drink 14 ounces of wine per day. And for women, they can safely drink 7 ounces of wine per day. Now, of course, alcohol percentages vary, so it's probably good that we use this figure of 14 ounces and 7 ounces. But again, you cannot binge drink. When you exceed the 14 ounces, guys, you begin damaging your liver. And if you do it often, your liver becomes more damaged. Now, this doesn't mean that we guys can go toss back half a bottle of wine per day with no effects whatsoever. We have to keep in mind that this amount of wine for some people can easily put you over the legal limit and impair your driving. And there may be other reasons to avoid this quantity of alcohol. What we're talking about here only affects the liver. So keep in mind that your mileage may vary and you may want to consume less than that. But at least you can know that if you happen to have, 2 or 3 glasses of wine in a particular setting, you may feel a little inebriated, but it doesn't appear that guys will be doing any permanent damage to their livers. Now, does this mean you should do it every night? Probably not. But again, the optimal consumption is 1 glass, roughly 4 ounces of wine per day. For men, a half a glass for women. Now, why does this wine work? What does this do for us? Well, it appears to reduce the risk of coronary death, which I would say is a good thing. It can have a slight yet positive effect on cholesterol levels. But at the same time, it can raise your triglycerides, which is another blood fat that is tied to heart disease. So you need to be careful. On the positive side, wine is a decent source of antioxidants, and that can also help reduce the cardiac risk. There's also some thought that antioxidants can reduce your risk of developing cancer. And speaking of cancer, for women, there is special concern about alcohol and its ties to breast cancer. Now, unfortunately, the studies are all over the place. Some show that there's an increased risk of breast cancer when you consume alcohol. Others show there's no effect. Here, it would seem that the wisest thing to do would be to use common sense. If you are at risk for breast cancer due to history in the family or whatever, then it may be best to not add to the risk until more data comes in. Again, I'm not giving you medical advice. Feel free to do whatever you want. But when you want to make your decisions, at least you'll have some of the information you need. And guys, let's not forget something here. We don't like to think about it, but breast cancer can occur in men as well. It may not happen as often, and I don't know if many guys are going to brag about the fact that they came down or were diagnosed with breast cancer, but it does occur. So this is not strictly a women's only issue. It affects both genders, but certainly it affects the women in our lives, and we need to be aware of that. Now, on the good side, there is some research that shows that wine is helpful in avoiding colon cancer, but other forms of alcohol may not be as helpful. Also, remember that alcohol abuse can not only harm your liver, but it can cause pancreatitis, which often leads to pancreatic cancer, and that is almost always fatal. So we need to remember to keep it in moderation. As my old chemistry teacher in college used to say, if a little is good, a lot is not necessarily better. Now, what about for another special group of people, mothers-to-be? We all know that alcohol abuse can cause a number of problems for the unborn child, and of course a host of problems in a new baby. But there doesn't seem to be as much research that shows that a drink of wine once in a while causes any problems. Now, we know that birth defects can occur even when mothers take excellent care of themselves and drink no alcohol, but there doesn't seem to be any research that ties light alcohol consumption once in a while to any problems. Now, alcohol may inhibit the proper absorption of folic acid by the mother's body, and medical research has shown that folic acid in sufficient amounts reduces the risk of spina bifida, which is a crippling spinal defect. So you may want to take that into consideration. Again, I can't give you any advice, but in the case of pregnancy, discretion is probably the better part of valor. It sounds as though a glass of wine once or twice a month, maybe a few sips of wine is probably better, may not have any harmful effects on the unborn child. But it seems that this is something that definitely should be discussed with the woman's doctor so as not to miss anything and to get the latest thinking on the subject. Now, a recent survey of current medical literature has suggested that red wine may reduce the risk of prostate cancer. And more research is coming out that shows that red wine has positive effects on the cardiovascular system. And it really is the red wine that seems to do this. There is something in the, we don't know if it's the tannins, we don't know where it comes from, but there's this substance, well, I shouldn't say we don't. I don't know where it comes from. The experts do. But there are these different compounds in red wine that doesn't appear in white wine that seems to have these positive effects on our health. So in conclusion, the research shows that in most cases, moderate alcohol consumption is harmless and often helpful to one's health. Heavy drinking on any one day has harmful effects, so you should probably play it smart, limit yourself to a glass or so each day, and maybe less if there's a good reason to do so. But definitely check with your own doctor to see if you should avoid alcohol for any reason. Obviously, if you have a history of alcoholism in your family, there may be a chance that you could develop alcoholism yourself. Certain medications that you may be taking may not react well with alcohol. We all know that wine enhances our lives, but it's certainly not worth endangering our health or even dying over. So that's it for this episode. Next time we'll pick up with some wine region or wine grape, probably a wine region since we've covered a lot of grapes so far and haven't talked much about the various geographic regions where wine is made. But I do want you to remember our show's motto, that you should drink what you like and keep trying new things because all the rest is commentary. Have a great week and we'll see you soon.